Before I get started, I just want to very quickly thank two people who have been very helpful in terms of me working with electoral data. So one, they're my colleagues in a number of ways. One is Milan Vaishnav, who's at the Carnegie Endowment. He actually provided me a cleaned up version of the ECI data, the Elections Commission data. The other person is Devesh Kapoor. He's also the head of the Center for Advanced Study of India, where I'm based. Devesh Kapoor and Milan have also edited a lot of my stuff. So a lot of the things that have been published, the graphs, the data, they've looked over and sort of helped me out quite a bit in terms of making sense of it. I want to start with a couple of orienting questions, sort of things I'm going to be dealing with today, and how that helps us understand the election in general. So the first one is this thing that was reported widely, which is the BJP won 282 seats, which is a majority of seats, on just 31% of the vote share. If we look in 2009, the Congress won 206 seats on 29% of the vote share. So with a very small change in vote share, there was of course a huge increase in seat share, right? And so one of the natural questions to ask here is, what explains that efficiency? The second set of questions is what's broadly the Modi wave question, right? India had its highest ever turnout this time, 66%, and that's 8% above what it was in 2009. And really, what is that relationship between the increase in turnout and BJP's victory? So this is a map a lot of you have seen. One of the things that I've added, which is very funny that you don't actually see it in most of the maps that are given in the election, are where the party actually contested, right? And you can see that I'm restricting this to BJP. And I'll talk about this at the very end, about why you don't want to just treat NDA as BJP. There are actually very big differences when you think about coalition politics versus when you're thinking about single party. Okay, so obviously in large swaths of the country, the BJP didn't contest their seats. They had alliance partners, or actually, well, everywhere they had at least one partner. So at least in all of the gray, there was at least one partner contesting. But in the seats that they did contest, they won 66% of the time, which is a spectacular strike rate, right? And so you can sort of see, and I'm going to break this down in some more detail, that there's a lot of geographic variation here. Okay, so moving to the regional variation. So one of the things that I've really pulled out of the data is looking at a certain set of regions and a certain set of states. So let's take these 6 states: Bihar, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, and UP. Okay? In these 6 states, BJP won 194 out of 213 seats. It's a massive strike rate, over 90%. And it's also almost 70% of the total number of seats they won, right? So this is sort of where all their seats are. Let's take these other 5 states: Andhra, Kerala, Odisha, Tamil Nadu, and West Bengal. Here, the BJP won 7 out of 100 seats, right? 7% strike rate, 2% of the total seats, right? So just massive regional variation going on. You can kind of see that that's what you would expect from looking at this map. Okay. So if we're able to just sort of see what this looks like map-wise, I've just broken this down. You have just sort of bits and pieces, little bits of orange. It isn't that they didn't contest. There are large swaths they didn't contest, but even when they did contest, they basically lost, right? And here, they lost in a few areas, but broadly they won all the time. The gray down here is where Shiv Sena competed, right? So that's why there's a large area of gray in Maharashtra. One of the things that we don't actually talk about because the BJP did so well is this is Eastern Bihar. They did not do very well in Eastern Bihar. BJP lost every seat it contested. And that's an area that's sort of an interesting thing. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but if people are interested in sort of thinking about what's going to happen in Bihar going forward, this is an area where the Muslim vote actually did consolidate against the BJP. This is sort of right on the border of West Bengal, so it has a bit of the Bengali influence, and it has a strong Muslim population. In order to sort of split the data, one of the simple analyses I did was to say a party was considered competitive in a constituency if it was one of the top 2 vote getters in the constituency. So if you're finishing 3rd or worse, you're probably not competitive except in a few states, right? So if you look at the constituencies in which it contested, the BJP was competitive in 79% of them, and they had an amazing strike rate when they were competitive. They won 84% of the time.
Just a quick question of clarification. Is that a standard political science assumption, or is there some arbitrariness in what constitutes being competitive? Is it context? Is it the top two, the top three? How would you pick that?
So it is. This is an arbitrary rule I put together. There's a reason as I go forward that you'll see I did it this way. But if I want to think about competitiveness, you may want to think about margins of victory. But again, that's not great because there often are two competitive parties, but a margin of victory of 20 or 25%. The way I think political scientists generally would argue that you should think of competitiveness as top two parties is that you still broadly have Duverger's law working within India, which is that in a first-past-the-post system, at the constituency level, you generally have two competitive parties. The one place where that's not true is UP. Okay, so this is sort of definition I'm going to be using all throughout this. Okay, so I wanted to sort of take a look here, and I'm going to sort of hammer this point home over and over again, so you'll see this here and you'll see it online. So this is where they were competitive, and this is where they won. This is that old map, right? Now, what you can see is that broadly, wherever they competed, they were competitive. The only stretch is exactly in those states where they did very poorly. So not only were they not winning, they weren't even competitive in many of those places, right? Where they were competitive, they basically won. But again, in that stretch, in a few places where they were even competitive, they still lost. Okay? So this is this sort of Hindi heartland, east coast of India divide that's going to show up all throughout the data, right? Okay, so now this is the reason why I wanted to make this definition of competitiveness. One of the things that we really want to be able to understand, and I'm going to harp on this in a little bit, is the extent to which BJP did very well in national competition, which is against the Congress Party, essentially, right? So in head-to-head competition against the Congress, how did it do? Because those are the only two parties that have the ability to make competing national visions in the Indian context, okay? And what you'll see is these are all of the constituencies when we went head-to-head. And head-to-head here means that the top two vote getters were either BJP or Congress, right? It's basically orange, right? Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, the BJP won these seats. And in fact, if we were to, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go down there again. If we are to break this down, I'm going to put this in writing later, the BJP has a strike rate of 88% in head-to-head contests against the Congress. So almost 9 out of 10 times it wins. Okay. So this is the map that on the left is the map that I just showed you. Now, if I then just add the extra seats that come from UP and Bihar, which is a lot of seats, they're big states, right? Those are states, those are the constituencies in yellow. And I add back, this is the most complicated map I have. All those constituencies that BJP lost, all the places they didn't contest. So the places they won are places that are in orange and yellow. You'll see that, in fact, the areas around UP and Bihar and those that they contested against Congress basically add up to all of the seats they won. Right? That's almost all of the variation is coming from competing against Congress and winning the seats in UP and Bihar. Right? When you add it all together, you're going to get that 247 out of the 282 seats that the BJP won came out of those two categories, which is 88% of their total seats. Right? The strike rate in UP and Bihar is very big. It's 85%. I'll talk a little bit. This is something I haven't written about. I talked to one of my very good friends who has given me a very interesting analysis of what happened in UP, and that's something I'm going to share with you in a little bit. But this is, this really, if you want to understand where the BJP made their victory, they made their victory going up against Congress. And they made their victory by figuring out how to win Bihar and UP in this election. So, making sense of this data. So it's obvious that that the results are extremely regionally concentrated. All the vote share is very, very few areas. And there are certain swaths of the country that didn't feel the Modi wave at all, right? They just didn't vote for BJP. The BJP was not even competitive, right? And this actually explains the conversion rate. So the way to think about this is, in a first-past-the-post system, you essentially have a wasted vote if you vote for somebody and they get 40% of the vote, because they're not going to win. The BJP either won or they did horribly in a constituency. That's it. So there are actually very, very few wasted votes in this system, right? Basically, if I'm voting for the BJP, I'm voting in a constituency where the BJP won. So in fact, outside of the categories I named of UP and Bihar, and outside of when they're competing against Congress, the BJP was actually only competitive in 39% of the constituencies. And in those constituencies, it had a much lower strike rate as well, at 63%, as opposed to in the high 80s. Right? So it's clear that either because of an intentional focus or because of underlying structural factors, that's really where a lot of this winning is taking place. And so I've written elsewhere, and I very much agree with this. So if you sort of look at the way the campaign went, you look at the sort of messages that were portrayed, BJP was the only one that was able to come up with a national vision. And I've talked to a lot of people in Delhi about this. It's a very interesting campaign strategy. I think some of the dirty work that always happens in campaigns was being done by many of the lower level actors. But Modi sort of stayed on message, gave a national picture, gave a positive picture of I'm going to fix the economy, so on and so forth. There are a few places where he didn't do that, but that was really the exception, not the rule. Okay. The Congress was much more disorganized when it came to coming up with a national picture, and I think that shows in the data. Okay. But paradoxically, I think what the regional concentration shows us is that being a national party doesn't mean that you're representative of India. Right? India has a lot of regional variation, has a lot of vernacular politics, and the BJP was simply not able to break into those places. What you'll notice about all the places that were on the East Coast, those 5 states, and I'll talk more about them, is that they have strong regional parties. They're politically mobilized along very regional and vernacular lines. And the BJP doesn't really have an existing electoral base in those places. So unlike UP and Bihar, in places where, well, Bihar they were actually in the ruling coalition. In UP, where they had, for the last 10 to 15 years, not done as well, there was a time in the late 90s when they were a massive party in Bihar, and they had an electoral base. And that sort of brings me to this sort of next question about thinking about what do the states of West Bengal and UP tell us about the future of the BJP. So the UP story is interesting. So I was talking to a good friend of mine, Gilles Vernier. He is somebody, so I think some of you know him. He was at CSH, which is an institute in Delhi, and he's now just moved over to Ashoka University in Department of Political Science. And he's a specialist on Uttar Pradesh. So I was sort of asking him, how do you explain what you saw? And how do you explain the resurgence of BJP? And I very much buy his story. So the argument that he gave me is that to understand UP politics, and this is very much true for everyone who says UP politics, you have to understand the caste calculations. And the BJP voter base has always been the upper caste and what he calls the middle backward caste. And those are basically the non-dominant, the non-jat type OBC classes. That's sort of a class that they've been able to put together in the late 90s, and that's something that seems to have come back together in this election. So if you look at this election, you sort of see that the kind of message that Modi had of a certain type of economic inclusion really spoke to these populations that, because of the way that UP politics works, had sort of moved those guys to the side. Right? There was Dalit politics going on. There was whatever we would think of as Samajwadi Party politics, SP politics going on. But these guys had been sidelined, and this view of this message is something that sort of brought them back together. There was also very much an increase in voter turnout in the areas around the Muzaffarnagar riots. So there's reason to believe that that also played very much into gaining seats for the BJP. Now, West Bengal is interesting because I think a lot of the media has focused on something, but it's sort of gotten a lot of it wrong. So the BJP did very well this time in West Bengal. Last time it won 7% of the vote. This time it won 17% of the vote. And there's a big political vacuum for the second place party in West Bengal. So the BJP may very well emerge. But what people aren't talking about is that the BJP was still not very competitive in West Bengal. The 2 constituencies it won were Darjeeling and Asansol. It was competitive in North Calcutta and South Calcutta. And it was actually competitive in a very weird constituency, which is Malda, the South Malda. And that's a constituency that's a safe seat for Congress, and everybody else had very had a very low vote share, and the BJP just came in second. Okay. Now what's interesting about the other 4 constituencies I named is that they all have very high Hindi-speaking populations. Right? So it's unclear that the BJP is going to be able to break into West Bengal unless it's able to create a strong voter base among the Bengali-speaking population. So even a lot of the stuff that has recently received media attention about party workers from the CPM moving to BJP, those were all in and around Calcutta. So the challenge is going to be for them to sort of move out of that area. And that's going to be the challenge for building a base in general in these sort of regionally strong states. Can it create voter bases in vernacular states, essentially, non-Hindi speaking states among non-Hindi speaking populations? Okay, so I'm now going to move to the idea of increasing turnout. Okay, so I'm not going to get into this business of, was it the BJP or was it Modi that increased turnout? This is larger idea of the Modi wave referring to new voters coming into the system. Okay, and I'm going to undertake an analysis of turnout change between 2009 and 2014. So in plain English, it's where did the voter turnout increase across India? All right, so this is the first, and this is going to require a little bit of explanation. This is the first graph I want to show you. Where the turnout increase was less than 5%, the BJP only won 24% of the time. When it was more than 5%, it won 81% of the time. So there's your first sort of example that maybe there's a situation where there's some relationship between an increase in voter turnout and support for the BJP. So what I've done here, and I'm not going to, this isn't a stats talk, and I do have a stats side to me. What I've done here, because increase in turnout is actually a continuous variable, what I've done is I fit a flexible spline, a penalized spline. So this is basically something that flexibly fits the data but doesn't overfit the data, to try to understand continuously how the probability of the BJP winning is changing as an increase in turnout. Okay? And it crosses the 50% mark around here, around 5.3%. Okay? What I've plotted down here are, it's in saffron if the BJP won, and it's in this light blue color if the BJP lost. Okay? And you can see there's a lot of separation in the data actually, right? And by the time you're getting up to 15, 20, 25%, the BJP is almost assured of winning.
So why is it continuous?
Huh?
Why is it continuous?
The increase in turnout is a continuous variable, right? So that's my x, right? And so I just want to know, as a function of the continuous change, how's the probability changing? Yeah?
So you've given us this cool picture. I mean, how would you hypothesize the sort of the U-shaped bit at the beginning? Any speculation, any theorizing on that?
I think that the bottom is actually right at 0. Right? And there is, and I'm going to show some evidence of why you would expect it to be at 0. But essentially, when there was no change in voter mobilization, when voters were already mobilized, you should see the BJP doing very poorly. Okay? And that's just going to be something you'll see as this would go forward. That's the best I can give you. I don't believe in the U shape, but I do believe this is the bottom.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So the other question that you're actually going to have, I'm going to use that same competitiveness rule. So the question is, how do voters actually respond to the BJP? So one could be that, well, it just so happens that for various reasons where people turned out, that those are the types of people who are BJP voters. So what I want to know is, when the BJP was competitive, did we see a distinct difference in voter turnout? And we do, right? So when the BJP contested but wasn't competitive, there was only a 2% increase in voter turnout. When it didn't contest, there was a 4% increase. But when it was competitive, there's about a 10% increase, and when it was competitive against Congress, there's even a higher increase. Right? These are all significant differences. So, if I want to drill this into your head even further. If I do a heat map of where there's an increase in voter turnout and where the BJP won, this is that first map I showed. These maps look almost the same. Okay, so there's almost a one-to-one relationship.
In the areas where the BJP, let's say traditionally has not been strong, like the east and the south,
yeah,
does the same thing correlation hold? Higher turnout is showing better?
So
in the rare cases where it wants?
The answer is no, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit. It's because of Orissa. Orissa is a place where actually, if you didn't know anything else, you were just looking at the preliminary data, you would think the BJP would do much better. something weird happened statistically in Orissa that I have not talked to anybody who's been able to figure out. There was an increase in mobilization. The BJP was competitive in a lot of seats, and they basically lost all of them except for one. And so they sort of were not able to solve the puzzle of BJD.
There are some things reverse of what happened in UP. Maybe it became the meaning when there are three contestants: Congress, BJP, and BJD.
Yeah.
So the three-corner thing, basically the guy with the slight edge will win.
I've also had somebody suggest to me that the BJP was not campaigning as hard in Orissa, so maybe they'd made calculations to say that we have to campaign harder in a place like UP and Bihar because there are more seats to win. So that's another possibility. But if they do ever solve the puzzle of BJD, there are a lot of seats to be won in Orissa for BJD. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the regional variation. Right? The regional variation, you can see there's a lot of it here, right? But some interesting things come up here. So if you remember the 6 states I named, right? They were Bihar, UP, Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Gujarat. Right? These are the 15 most populous states in India. If you remember the 5 states I named where they did very poorly, they are West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, Orissa, Tamil Nadu. So it's very obvious that the BJP did very well in low turnout states and very poorly in high turnout states. Right? The challenges are very different, right? This is exactly where all the increase in voter share happened. This is where a lot of the apathetic voters are. But the challenge in states where there are strong regional parties is that you have to switch the votes of voters who are already mobilized along regional lines. It's a very big challenge for the BJP, and given their message, it's very hard for them. Now the big question here, I'll talk about this as I sort of conclude, is who are these guys that showed up, right? I mean, we're getting double-digit increases, right? We have some idea that these are urban voters, but it's not just urban voters. We know that they're young voters, but there weren't disproportionately many young voters this time as compared to other elections. So there's just a large reservoir of apathetic voters in these places. This friend of mine, Gilles, suggests that some of these, at least some percent of these, were those middle backward castes who felt like they were out of the system, but came back to vote this time. Okay. So to hammer the point home on regional variation, you can see that those 6 states, things are very, very red. And actually the one place where it's not very, very red is exactly where Shiv Sena was. Right? And then here, it's just a sea of yellow. This is getting to the 0% point. Only place where things are different is Orissa. So it's interesting to see what's going to happen there going forward. Okay, so the big question here, who are the new voters? We actually don't know. There's no good data on this. I was talking to a friend of mine at CSDS. I said, you guys should really go after this. And he said, our survey data, and I am a big fan of CSDS post-poll data. Like, our survey data is very good, but you'd have to have absolutely amazing survey data to be able to pull out who the new voters are, right? So this is just an open one. This is something that none of us really know. I think we're all grasping at who these people are and what they want, and maybe it's something that we can sort of discuss going forward. Yeah.
Have you looked at gender?
Gender in terms of the ECI data or in terms of survey data?
ECI data.
So how would
Each constituency, they'll give you the gender turnout. Because we have a paper we've shown that a large increase in voter turnout, at least at the state elections, not at the national elections,
is due to women?
Is due to women.
Yeah. And so we do know that there's
wherever the women turnout is higher, we've shown at least in one natural experiment in Bihar, they vote very differently from that.
No, absolutely. And in fact, we know this time that women's turnout was higher than usual. There were several states where there were women, that the women essentially caught up to the men. So that's actually a very interesting hypothesis, right? Is that if that's where it's going, and then were women disproportionately voting for the BJP, right? Would have to be where that goes in general. So I haven't looked at that data. Actually, I have that variable incidentally, because I collected, Millen is very interested in this question. He's collected the difference in gender turnout. So it's something I can actually run relatively quickly. So then the other big question is, looking at those states where there's regional mobilization, can the BJP actually convert people who have already been mobilized? That's a very different challenge than bringing out new voters. And it's clear that that was what happened this time. And the third question, of course, is what's the BJP going to have to do going forward in order to hold on to new voters? So I want to now quickly go and talk about actually some data that was collected a while back, but is still very relevant for being able to understand the data that I've presented to you. So the Lok Foundation, along with myself, Milan, and Devesh, have been running a set of surveys all across India, huge surveys. And the person running them is sitting right here. It's Mahesh. We're running it with CMIE, and they've done a fantastic job. And you'll see how rich this data is. So these are data that were collected in the last quarter of 2013. So it is, it's about 4 to 6 months before the election. But a lot of the results we believe still hold today and sort of open our eyes into what we were sort of picking up in this data, and I want to talk a little bit about this. So this is a survey that's planned to go on for multiple years. It's not just about elections. It just so happened we're doing this in conjunction with elections. It's about social attitudes more generally, so about discrimination and so on and so forth. There are 68,500 households across 24 states and union territories. And I have in blue all of the states and union territories that we cover. So you can see it's basically everywhere except for some areas in the Northeast. So it's an incredible undertaking, and it's providing a lot of very interesting data. So one of the first things we noticed, and a lot of you have been to some of the presentations that my colleagues Devesh Kapoor or Milan Vaishnav, and so I'm going to present a lot of the stuff that they've presented here. One of the things we noticed even way back then was that it was the economy dominating people's concerns, right? People worried about economic growth, people worried about inflation, people worried about personal income. This data comes from a question where we ask them, what is the thing that bothers you the most, right? We sort of force a choice, okay? Even corruption is not technically an economic issue, but I think many people in India do see the corruption issue in economic terms, right? Now what's interesting here is given a lot of the analysis of the election, people didn't really talk about leadership, they didn't talk about identity, they didn't even really talk about access to government benefits, right? And, okay, I can see that someone will maybe not answer a question on identity directly. It's quite amazing that this number is below 10% as well, right? Indians have never, in my experience, shied away from saying, I want government benefits, I want stuff, right? So this was actually a bit of a shocker for us.
Neelanjan?
Yeah.
If someone says, I don't like this government because I didn't get a job, because unemployment was one of the biggest issues.
Yeah.
Is that economic growth or is that access to government benefit?
So
NREG is a big component.
So my reading of that would be, if I believe that I didn't get a job because of NREGA, then I would probably say access to government benefits. But if I view it as a job in the marketplace more generally, then I would think of it as economic growth, right? I mean,
And the data is rural, urban, it's a fairly balanced.
yeah, well, it's not a balanced sample. We knew it was not a balanced sample, but we've broken the data by rural and urban. I'm going to actually talk about that in a second. Where you get the most variation is across states. So economic growth was the largest category, right? And this is the thing that they were concerned the most about when it came to their growth choice, right? And so you can see, you can see that there are several states at the top. Nearly half of the respondents are worried about economic growth in particular. And UP and Bihar are way down here at the bottom. In these states, corruption figured much more heavily. So this is actually where a lot of the variation is coming in terms of about worrying about issues in economic growth. Right? So we just coded here the top issues by state. Every state had either corruption, economic growth, or inflation as the number one issue. Right? Some of these are surprising, like Kerala, up here at 43% for corruption. But this actually was referring to some local corruption that was going on at that time. Unfortunately, that sort of ran into a tough time. But everything else here, I think, makes a lot of sense in terms of what we're worried about. And people are grafting on state-level concerns onto the national government as well. Clearly, you see West Bengal at 38% on economic growth.
Well, the interesting thing about the Kerala number is that it still then went on to the incumbent one.
Yeah, exactly.
At 43% concern about corruption.
Maybe it was all of his opponents who were concerned.
Yeah. But
No, it's quite possible that in Kerala the BJP ate into the left vote.
Yeah,
Because I think if the anti-incumbent vote got split between the left and the BJP, then the chances of the UDF winning were high. I would have thought that's the reason.
But are we assuming the voters can't tell the difference between parliamentary and state assembly elections?
No, I mean, I think they can on some level, but
I thought there's a lot of literature to show that they do vote very differently on national issues and local issues.
I think that's right, and so I'm a believer in that personally. That being said, I think that that's just to say that there's no relevance is an extreme statement, right? Just to say there's complete overlap is an extreme statement. There has to be some spillover, right? I mean, if I'm in a state that's not performing well, I probably am somewhat worried about the economy irrespective, and that's something I'm going to answer to that question.
But just to sort of to clarify, the survey itself asks for how they reacted to the central government. In other words, when you deal with
for this vote that's coming up, so it was 6 months before the election.
So in theory, this is how they feel about the central government
Exactly.
of the UPA.
Right.
But you say that there's likely spillover to some extent.
Yeah, I mean that's not important for what I'm presenting here, but I suspect that this is something that one sees in this sort of data. What I want to the big point I want to get across here, if you just sort of put this, if you look at this thing and you look at all of the top issues, it's always the economy or maybe corruption, right? I mean, this is, when we think about the mandate, this is what people are thinking, right? We did many more things on discrimination and so on and so forth, and there's almost no doubt, I think, in any of our minds that this was really an economic mandate in the minds of voters. Okay, so asked about breaking the data by rural and urban. So
would this mean that if they take away all the benefits that they're giving, it would really make no difference?
Take away the
In
benefits.
terms of voting? Because that's really a big concern, the subsidies that are being given.
Absolutely. I mean,
Is that the hypothesis?
I don't pretend to have the electoral savvy of Amit Shah, but I will say that my instinct is that government benefits today matter much less than people think they do for voters. And the reason is, I was going to get to this, but I'll just make a point right now. It just is the case today that rural India isn't really rural India. If you live 3.5, 4 hours away from the city, you're still commuting to that city, right? The wage premium that's coming from non-farm labor in this day and age, as compared to farm labor, it's growing by leaps and bounds. And so there's a sense in which all of India is connected to the market in a way that it just hadn't been in the past. And in my personal research, which is sort of in villages in West Bengal, I've seen this very much as well. It's something I very much believe. So to the extent that people are worried about the sort of old, protected, rural voter who needs a handout, that guy doesn't really exist as much anymore, right? And that's part of the reason why we're seeing the shift.
Or could it also be that people state their concerns in terms of what they think they ought to be, like corruption is something nobody will say doesn't matter to me, even if it doesn't matter to me. I mean, whereas...
No, but they have to say which one matters to them most. I mean, it's not inappropriate to say.
Are they saying the politically correct things to say that this corruption matters, economic growth matters?
No, they have to say one of them.
What actually matters may be the rice subsidy or something like that.
No, but even corruption in NIRG.
Huh?
So corruption, see,
Okay.
it's very tricky.
It's a very-
Yeah, exactly,
Question
right,
as-
I know,
Because
right.
they are first of all hypothetical.
Right.
They are perception based. And that's why Keralites will say corruption is the biggest thing, while we might think Kerala is least corrupt.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Relative to other states. So there's a problem with that.
So-
But no, going back to corruption, is it corruption, the UPA Delhi type corruption?
Yeah.
Or are we saying that, I'm entitled to 100 days, but I just got 3 days?
No, but
That's
this
not
is
corruption.
no, and to be just completely honest, and this is a discussion Mahesh and I have had. Every respondent is going to respond in the way that they think is possible. Actually, the biggest problem. So we had a lot of discussions about keeping economic growth and inflation as separate categories or together, right? I mean, at what point did someone say I care more about inflation and not economic growth?
But just to add a little Neelanjan,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
This question took the maximum time in the answer. It was difficult for us to convey this to the respondents, and it was difficult for many of them to understand. So Neelanjan and company also insisted that you need to ask the question to a random member of the household. Often that was an illiterate old woman who couldn't even comprehend these questions. So we really had to work hard to make them
Why
understand.
did you ask a random person?
Because we didn't want to ask only the most articulate person. That's what we do usually.
But then there's a problem with the data, because then how do I correlate this variable with the rest of the variables?
No,
all of the variables are on this.
Oh, it's just so this is not head of a household?
No.
all the-
Because we also had vote choice data, so you certainly didn't want to only pick the head of the
Okay,
household.
okay.
So-
Anyone above 18.
And I'll just tell you, the big punchline is the only variation that matters is that one. It's the state level variation. This is a point that Millen actually makes a lot, and I really like it. And I think it's very useful for us to think about today, and it's connected to an answer I just gave, which is just trying to think about this. There's this distinction that people often make between Bharat and India, right? The sort of rural, the sort of classic thing that I just said didn't exist, so you know where I'm going to stand on this, and India, right? And so you do see some differences here, right? I mean, you do see that the differences among rural literate for supporting BJP, so we broke this into NDA and UPA, I guess, for supporting the NDA are much greater than the rural illiterate. And same thing with the urban literate and illiterate. Although you'll see that across literate and across illiterate, the percentages are pretty much the same. And that sort of gives you a look into the next slide, right? Which is that there are differences across rural and urban India in our data, but that's not actually capturing the variation. Right? There's actually a remarkable amount of convergence across rural and urban India on these issues. And this was a big surprise to us. In fact, Miller and I wrote a blog post on the FT blog about this, right? When we saw this. So you do see things that make sense, like rural voters do care more about access to government benefits than urban voters do, but the shapes are pretty much the same, right? And this is really the first sign that there is a lot of economic integration breeds political integration, and there really is a lot of integration on in terms of the way that people think about political issues, in terms of politics, right? And that's very much what the data are throwing up. And they were throwing up a long time ago. I talked to the CSDS people after I got into Delhi. I've been in Delhi for a month. And I think they started noticing many of these sorts of patterns as well. This sort of the idea that urban and rural were actually starting to really come together in this election.
How did you define rural and urban?
This is we may not have enough time.
Just for the purpose of this.
So broadly, something that would be census defined as rural and something that's census defined as urban.
Really a quick question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Do you have a state variation for this? I mean, I'm just curious to know what UP and Bihar would be. If Jails is correct in what he's saying, then identity should matter in those states.
So identity didn't matter anywhere in our data on this type of question. Where it does matter and where things make more sense is when we asked people if they were more willing to vote for candidates of a certain identity.
So this is actually just relates to this, because I mean this goes to your question, Jackie. I mean, no one's going to admit that they're bigot and voting for someone because he belongs to my caste and so on.
There's another lurking variable here. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No.
Okay. There's another. The way we are asking people is what's mattering for their vote choice. So I've actually written about on this issue in particular. So let me give you my answer for what's going on. So when we estimate caste bias in terms of voting for candidates, we did a list experiment thing. You pretty much get very, very high rates of caste bias for voting for candidates. You get them exactly where you expect them, this sort of thing, right, that I initially was talking about. And then you have questions like this, and you see very, very low percent. So you say, okay, look, there's a response bias going on. So yes, there's perhaps some response bias going on. It's also a really pie in the sky question. Does your identity matter for your vote choice? But the other thing that I really want to encourage people to think about is that if I were to look at the election outcomes last time, and I'm to look at the election outcomes this time, it would always be the case that an upper caste person is more likely to vote for BJP than an OBC person than a scheduled caste person. That was true in 2009, that's true in 2014. But if that was all you hung your hat on, you would completely miss the result, right? The point is that identity is fixed, right? And people's identity concerns are fixed. And the way that parties for generations and generations have been picking candidates are hooked onto those identities. That's not something that's changing across the electorate from 2009 to 2014. Right? So what matters for my vote choice? Okay, look, whatever caste belief I have about you, I've already figured into my calculations about party A, B, or C. But the economy is something that's changing. And that's something that does change from election to election. And it just has to be, given the volatility we know that exists in the Indian electoral system, you should have a variable that's at least somewhat volatile to explain some of that variation. Otherwise, it's kind of odd. Yeah?
But these are people who've come out and voted, or this is just...
This is 6 months before. So, looking forward, this is the last slide I have, and then we can open it up for a discussion. I wanted to sort of talk about one thing that, so this whole analysis has been about the BJP and not the NDA. And I want to talk about what this means in this context. So when I've been in Delhi this time, I've had a lot of conversations with E. Sridharan, who's the head of UPSC in Delhi, for those of you who know him. He's actually also our counterpart at CASI, the Delhi side, and E. Sridharan is the academic director of this organization. And he also is a specialist on electoral coalitions. So he's been telling me, and he's right about this, I absolutely agree with this, that people are completely misanalyzing what it means for the BJP to get a majority. Because coalition politics still matter a lot. And we've seen this with the recent sort of goings on with Shiv Sena, as the BJP still stuck by their coalition partner. And why does that happen, right? The reason is, if you just take the set of states in which the BJP had a coalition partner, a sizable coalition partner, had it not won those seats, it wouldn't have gotten a majority. You have to realize that when you break an electoral coalition, it isn't as if you've just given away those seats. Those guys are also going to run against you next time, right? So it would mean to break a coalition with the Shiv Sena would mean I also have to beat the Shiv Sena in head-to-head competition. That's another way to split the vote, right? So it is the case, this is what we call an oversized coalition. This is, as he's explaining, this is right, because I study West Bengal, this is the exact same logic the CPM used in West Bengal. They kept their left front buddies there for electoral purposes, even when they were winning majorities, because it helped, right? You didn't want the left vote splitting if you're CPM. You need to make sure that they weren't running against you. It's the same logic here. So, since the logic of a coalition is electoral, and there is an electoral purpose to the coalition, there's little reason to believe that there's a significant change in coalition politics, even with this sort of oversized coalition. Now, this is sort of interesting, right? I mean, because we know that some of those coalition partners may be less friendly to a certain kind of economic liberalization agenda, right? And this is something the BJP is going to have to navigate. No matter what it wants, it also is clearly not going to drop its coalition allies, right? And it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. It isn't the case that just because they want a majority, the coalition doesn't matter anymore. Yeah?
But this is actually an absolutely fantastic point you just made. That even to understand this win, this huge majority, it's predicated upon the coalition existing as they fought the election. So in other words, it's illogical, so it's the wrong counterfactual to say that they would have won a majority anyway.
That's right.
Because they would have then been competing against their former allies.
Exactly.
That's a fantastic point.
Yeah. It's not my point, that's E. Sridharan's point.
Okay.
So you know.
Sri's on the money on this one.
Yeah, he's absolutely on the money on this. Well, that's why I said it, because I was like, oh, okay.
Neelanjan, another, just to strengthen this argument,
Yeah.
many people, I mean, this is now a known fact, that one of the points of negotiation of the BJP with its allies was whether Modi would campaign for the allies.
That's right.
And if you actually go back and get the data again on Modi campaigning,
Yeah.
it will really strengthen your argument.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. And that's something that, so there, yes, go ahead.
There were two states that you point out where BJP won big. And these are all non-coalition states, right? UP, Bihar, Rajasthan.
So UP technically is a coalition state. Bihar is a coalition state.
Bihar is a coalition. There are three parties there.
Three parties.
BJP, and that.
Yeah,
But
that's-
as far as vote sharing would go,
Kushal
I mean,
would
as
go.
far as the seat
No, like,
sharing would
in
go.
Bihar, the coalition mattered.
I mean, you can call them coalition, but like they're the big party. Like I wouldn't say in Andhra Pradesh that is a genuine
Or
coalition.
Punjab, for instance, right?
That would be a genuine coalition, but these are states, big states, where BJP on its own could have actually won. I mean, if you look at state performance, I would be hard pressed to believe that this argument would hold individually in states.
Sorry, and actually to go back to your original point, or Sri's point, it works in reverse. In other words, Shiv Sena did well in Maharashtra because they were part of a coalition.
Absolutely, yeah.
Lots of South Bombay folks I know would never have voted for the Shiv Sena if they were competing on their own.
Right. No, of course. And so,
So,
but
it works in, so that actually reinforces the point, right?
yeah. And I mean, the counterfactual is very hard to figure out, right? How would the BJP still would have done fantastically well without any coalition partners. I seriously doubt it would have gotten a majority because it's only 10 seats above the majority, right? So it's not going to win those. It's not going to win, you know, a few seats here and there, right? Just by sheer competition effects. Had it not been coalition, the LJP one is actually very important for them. Incidentally, Bihar, that one I do disagree with you. That was a genuine coalition.
No, so would you be able to show, for example, in that LJP perhaps came second, cut RJD's vote, and therefore BJP was able to win? I think that would be really interesting.
No, what the LJP did is it delivered seats directly, right? And
Yeah,
it delivered seats to BJP.
3 seats.
What?
How LJP had 6 seats?
I think it's 6, right? They won all 6, right?
They won all 6.
Yeah. And they won in an area where BJP would have had a very hard time winning.
That's small part.
Yeah, it's a small party, but it's a party that when they put their candidates, they win, right? I mean that's or in this election, right?
No, I think a lot of the BJP vote went to them because the fact is their group is only 6% of the population.
Exactly.
So they won't have won 6 seats, but for the big phalanx of BJP vote very well.
So anyway, I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about. But if you're only 10 seats above the majority, you have to believe, even if you believe that this time they somehow would have gotten a majority, which I seriously doubt without coalition partners, you have to believe that you're going to be able to do that again 5 years down the line without your coalition partners. Right?
So, but this seems to suggest that any party that can get these 4 or 5 states should be in a good position to form the government all the time.
Getting those 4 or 5 states, well, sweeping 4 or 5 states.
Yeah.
I think UP is the unrepeatable in future.
70 out of 80 is pretty, 70 plus out of 80. Right?
And 73 out of 80 is not possible ever.
Yeah, I mean, it beat Amit Shah's own predictions by 10. So,
It's the bullwhip effect. I think when it goes that direction, it goes the full hog.
If you look at the significance of the thing that you were talking about, I think that bipolarity, if you ran a regression, I think that bipolarity is very, very important. Apparently, I was told by a friend that the last time something like the UP result happened was in 1984 in Haryana, where they got 96% of the seats. So the configuration of head-to-head contests in Uttar Pradesh. So the effect of bipolarity might actually overwhelm all the other effects that you're talking about.
No, I mean, definitely, look, I mean, you can already see in Bihar, they believe they split their votes too many different ways, and the opposition is coalescing, right? And I suspect.
So that's also something that explains the difference between East Bihar and the other Bihar.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's true.
So,
How do the sort of additional seats that as a result, additional voters as a result of new people coming in to vote actually play out in this? Because obviously voter turnout is a percentage, but it's a percentage on a larger base.
So, you know, one thing we can't look, it's very suggestive that the thing that you do not want to say is everywhere where the new voters turned out, the existing voters also didn't shift their preferences. That we don't know, right? It could be that new voters turned out and also existing voters shifted their preferences, right? We don't know. But there's a lot of suggestive evidence, even with young voters. Again, we can't really pinpoint who the new voters are, but at least with young voters, they did disproportionately vote for the BJP, right? And so, and that's something that's come from CSDS data as well. I think that's something that we also see in our own data, in terms of but it was, it's a few percentage points, but a few percentage points matter a lot. But in terms of whether it was explicit, it was only the new people who voted for the BJP, that's sort of a very hard thing to say. I can't say where people were not mobilized, nobody seemed to switch their votes. Yeah.
The data you showed earlier from the Lok survey, if you were to split that by age group, were there any major differences?
So there was a slight move towards BJP, but quite honestly, at that point, we weren't picking up huge differences. Right?
No, so regardless of BJP, I'm saying those issues around economic growth, inflation, so on and so forth.
So no, we actually weren't picking up mass. As I said, you know, the reason is, it's not that there aren't differences. There are differences, but they all look like this. Right, there are a few percentage points. Nothing is going to get past this. Right, I mean, you know, the difference between 7 and 43 is a lot more than the difference between 23 and 27, right? And all of the differences we have across groups and within groups, no matter how you slice the data, are these kinds of differences.
What sort of, on the basis of this, what prediction would you make for future states where there's head-to-head competition?
head-to-head competition between who and who? I mean,
Upcoming election.
so look, I mean, this was, if I just go back to this map, right? I mean, what is this? I mean, this is spectacular, right? I mean, this is, there have to be anti-incumbency effects, right? I mean, I can't imagine that this happens again like this, although the Congress is really in disarray, so who knows, right? So I would suggest that, you know, the sort of massive sweeping of states, that's unlikely to occur. You just by anti-incumbency, a few constituents will go here and there. The thing that will be important to watch for BJP if it wants to hold on to power, I mean, you know, it's got a massive advantage right now, is how well it starts breaking into some of these other places, right? So Bengal is actually a place that I'm looking at, Orissa is another place I'm looking at quite carefully. These are the kinds of places where you can, if you start seeing a few more seats go this way or that way, that makes up for the few seats that they start losing in the places that have been safe, right?
And Bihar, where you've actually got the consolidation of the other side now.
Well, it'll be hard for, you know, those places, I mean, UP will be very hard to hold on to this many seats. Bihar will also be difficult if there's actually proper consolidation. I say proper consolidation because that's important, right? They actually, if the actual party workers start beating each other up, even if they're technically for the same opposition, then, you know, it's not going to have much of an effect. But we don't know.
And the margin of victory you can also analyze and tell us, you know, head to head, how big was the margin?
Head to head, how big was the margin between?
Victory between BJP and the Congress.
So it was about, I didn't put this data here, but it's around 20 percentage points.
20%?
It's actually more, the average winning percentage was about 18%, and it was between, I think it was between 19 and 20.
So there was no competition.
Yeah, exactly. In that sense, there's no competition. I mean, they really beat them up badly. I mean, this was not a close election in the places they swept.